He signed without looking because that was who he had become, a man who trusted speed more than silence, a man who believed hesitation was weakness and precision was instinct. And as the pen touched the paper, the room seemed to exhale. Around him, crystal lights, steady voices, low, the deal already done in his mind long before the ink dried. And somewhere behind him a voice had already tried, once soft, calm, almost invisible. You might want to check that page again. But Ethan Caldwell did not build an empire by listening to waitresses, so he ignored it the way powerful men ignore small warnings, the way storms ignore the first drop of rain. And Clara Whitmore stepped back into the rhythm of the room, carrying plates, refilling glasses, her presence dissolving into the background. Yet her eyes never left the table, not the men, not the smiles, not the performance, but that one line buried in clean legal language, a number slightly shifted, a clause quietly inverted, a detail small enough to hide but large enough to break everything. And she had seen it instantly, not because she was looking for it, but because she always noticed what others dismissed, the pattern, the imbalance, the silence between words. And she had spoken once already, not louder, because truth does not need volume, only timing. But timing had passed, and now the pen had moved again, page after page, Ethan signing with practiced confidence, each stroke a decision, each signature a step deeper into something he had not truly read. And across from him the investors remained composed, too composed, their smiles polished, their patience unnatural, like actors waiting for a cue. And when the final page slid toward him, there was a moment, just a moment, where the world seemed to pause, not visibly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way that precedes irreversible things. And Clara felt it. She did not move, she did not speak again, she simply watched, because some lessons do not arrive through repetition. They arrive through consequence. And Ethan signed the last page, the ink dark and final, and for a second nothing happened. No applause, no handshake, no shift, just silence, the kind that stretches thin until it breaks. And then the lead investor leaned forward, his voice smooth, almost gentle. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. We will proceed under Clause 14B." And something changed, not in the room, but in Ethan. His expression still controlled, his posture unchanged, but his eyes flickered. Once a small disruption, a fracture in certainty. "Clause 14B, he repeated, not as a question, but as a correction, because he knew every clause in every deal except this one. And the pages moved quickly, now faster than before, hands flipping paper, eyes scanning lines. And there it was, the number wrong, the percentage reversed, the control shifted, not away, not lost, but given, signed, transferred legally, cleanly, undeniably. And the realization did not explode, it settled, slow, heavy, undeniable, like gravity. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan did not speak immediately, because the memory arrived first, not of the contract, not of the numbers, but of a voice, soft, calm, steady. "You might want to check that page again." And then the image followed the way the checkbook had been moved, slightly aligned with that exact line, the subtle precision, the quiet insistence. And suddenly the room felt different, the investors still smiling, but smaller, less important, and his attention moved across the space, past the glass, past the noise, until it landed on her, Clara, standing exactly where she had been, not proud, not afraid, not waiting, just present. And he stood slowly, not rushed, not dramatic, but deliberate, because something inside him had shifted, not the loss, not the mistake, but the understanding of it. And he walked toward her, ignoring the voices behind him, the explanations, the legal language, the consequences forming in real time, because none of that mattered. Yet what mattered was the moment he had dismissed, the moment he had chosen not to listen. And when he stopped in front of her, there was no anger in his voice, no accusation, only something unfamiliar, something almost quiet. "Why did you not say it clearer?" he asked. And Clara met his gaze without hesitation, without apology. "I did," she said, and the words were simple, but they carried more weight than the contract, more truth than the room. "You just did not listen." And the silence that followed was different from before. It was not tension, it was recognition, the kind that settles deeper than pride, deeper than loss. And for the first time, Ethan Caldwell felt the cost, not in numbers, not in power, but in the space between being told and choosing not to hear. And behind them the deal continued, the consequences unfolding, the room adjusting to a new reality. But in that small space between a CEO and a waitress, something far more permanent had already changed, because he had lost more than control. In that moment, he had lost the illusion that he could afford to ignore quiet voices. And Clara turned slightly, reaching for the table, lifting the cup of coffee. He had barely touched the liquid, now cold, untouched. and she replaced it with a fresh one, without a word, without a gesture of significance, just an action, simple, precise. And he noticed that too, the difference, the temperature, the intention, and this time, when she stepped back, he did not look away, he did not dismiss her, he simply nodded once, not as a command, not as a habit, but as acknowledgement, and it was small, almost invisible to everyone else. But for him, it was the first time he had truly seen her, not as a role, not as a background, but as a presence that had been there all along. And the room slowly filled with sound again, conversations returning, papers moving, deals adjusting. But something remained in that silence, a lesson, not spoken, not forced, just understood, that sometimes the difference between success and failure is not intelligence or power, but the willingness to listen when the voice is quiet and the moment is easy to ignore. And as Ethan reached for the new cup of coffee, he did not drink immediately. He paused just for a second, feeling the warmth in his hand, aware of the difference, aware of what had been missed before and what would not be missed again. And across the room, Clara continued her work, moving between tables, unseen by most, but no longer invisible to the one person who had finally learned that the quiet ones are never truly ordinary. The warmth of the new coffee lingered in Ethan Caldwell's hand longer than he expected, as if the simple heat carried more weight than the contract he had just signed away. And for the first time in years, he did not immediately return to control, to correction, to strategy, but remained still, standing in the middle of a room that had already begun to move on without him. Voices rising again, investors shifting into the language of ownership and clauses and next steps, while he stayed rooted in a moment that had already passed yet refused to let him go. Because the truth was no longer hidden in numbers or documents, but in something far more difficult to accept, something quieter, something he could not rewrite or renegotiate. The fact that he had been told and chose not to hear. And across the room, Clara Whitmore continued her work without pause, her movements precise, unhurried, unaffected by the shift in power that everyone else could feel but could not name. Because for her nothing had changed, not the rhythm, not the responsibility, not the understanding of how people move through spaces, believing they see everything, when in reality, they only see what they expect to see. And Ethan watched her in a way he had never watched anyone before, not evaluating, not measuring, but observing. The way she carried a tray without looking down, the way she anticipated a gesture before it was made, the way she listened without appearing to listen at all. And it unsettled him, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was consistent, deliberate, practiced. And he realized that what he had dismissed as background had in fact been awareness all along, a level of attention he himself had lost somewhere between success and certainty. And the realization did not arrive with anger, but with a quiet pressure behind his thoughts, a question he could not avoid. How many times had this happened before? How many voices had he overlooked simply because they did not come wrapped in authority or status or familiarity? And the answer was not immediate, but it was there, building, uncomfortable, undeniable. And he moved again finally, not toward the investors, not toward the damage already unfolding, but toward the source of the moment that now defined everything differently. And when he reached Clara, she did not stop what she was doing, did not acknowledge his presence with urgency or surprise, only finished placing a plate on a nearby table, adjusted a glass by a fraction of an inch, and then turned to him with the same calm expression she had held from the beginning. And in that stillness, Ethan understood something else. That power did not always announce itself. That clarity did not require recognition to exist. And for a second, he did not speak because the words he was used to using no longer applied. There was no command here, no negotiation, no leverage, only a simple need to understand something he had missed. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, not in volume, but in certainty. "What did you see?" he asked. And Clara considered the question not as a challenge, but as a request, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged. "A discrepancy," she said. "Just one." And the simplicity of it struck him harder than any accusation could have, because it meant the difference between control and loss had been a single detail, a single moment, a single choice. Not to listen. And he nodded slowly, absorbing not just the information but the weight behind it. And for a moment neither of them moved, the space between them quiet but not empty, filled instead with something new, a recognition that had not existed minutes ago. And then the world returned again, more fully this time. a voice calling his name. Urgent, sharp, pulling him back into the consequences he could not ignore. "Mr. Caldwell, we need to address this immediately," the lead investor now. Standing, his tone no longer smooth but assertive, ownership already shifting in posture if not yet fully in execution. And Ethan turned back to the table, to the contract, to the reality he had signed into existence. And for a brief second the old instinct returned, the need to regain control, to push back, to find the angle that would restore balance. But it faded just as quickly as it came, replaced by something steadier, something less reactive, because he knew now that this was not a problem of strategy, but of awareness. And awareness could not be forced into existence after the fact. It had to be present before the decision. And he stepped forward, not with urgency, but with clarity, his voice calm as he addressed the room. "We will review every clause again," he said, and there was no argument in it. Only direction, not the authority of assumption, but the authority of correction. And the investors exchanged glances, subtle shifts in expression revealing the first cracks in their confidence. Because the man they expected to react with anger or denial had instead chosen something more difficult, restraint. And as the review began, Ethan did not rush, did not skim, did not rely on memory or instinct. He read every line, every number, every clause with a level of attention he had not given anything in years. And it was slower, yes, but it was also clearer, and piece by piece the structure of the deal revealed itself, not just in its intended form, but in its manipulation. The subtle ways language had been used to redirect power. The careful positioning of terms designed to pass unnoticed under the pressure of speed. And as he read, he understood that this was not a mistake, it was a test, not of intelligence, but of attention. And he had failed at the moment he chose not to look again. And when he finished, he closed the document gently, not with frustration, but with finality. "This does not stand," he said, and the room shifted again, tension rising, voices preparing to push back, to argue legality, to enforce the signature that had already been given. But Ethan did not engage in that rhythm, not yet, because he knew that the outcome of this moment would not be decided by volume or pressure, but by something else entirely, something he had just begun to understand. And he turned once more toward Clara, not because she had the solution, but because she had seen the problem before it became irreversible, and that mattered more than any negotiation. And she met his gaze again, not as someone waiting to be asked, but as someone who had already done what she could. And he gave a small nod, not of command, but of acknowledgement. And then he returned to the table with a different presence than before, not faster, not louder, but more precise. And the conversation that followed was no longer about recovering what was lost, but about redefining what would be accepted. And the investors pushed, as expected, citing agreements, signatures, obligations. But Ethan did not react in the ways they anticipated. He did not defend his position with emotion. He did not escalate. He simply pointed to the structure, the imbalance, the intent hidden in wording that relied on being overlooked. And as the minutes passed, the dynamic shifted again, because control does not always belong to the one who signs first. It belongs to the one who understands what was signed. And eventually the resistance softened, not out of concession, but out of recognition that the deal they had constructed depended on the assumption that it would not be challenged at this level of detail. And now it was. And when the final adjustment was made, when the clause was corrected, when the balance was restored, the room exhaled once more. But this time the silence that followed was different. It was not the silence before collapse. It was the silence after understanding. And Ethan leaned back slightly, not in relief, but in reflection, because the loss had been avoided, but the lesson remained. And he knew that what mattered was not the outcome of this deal, but the shift that had made the outcome possible. And when the meeting concluded, when the investors left with measured professionalism, and the room returned to its usual rhythm, Ethan remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes moving once again across the space until they found Clara, still working, still unnoticed by most. And he stood and walked toward her one last time. And when he reached her, there was no urgency in his voice, no demand, no transaction. Only a simple statement: "Thank you." And Clara paused just long enough to meet his eyes. Not surprised, not impressed, just aware. "You are welcome," she said, and turned back to her work. And Ethan did not try to extend the moment, did not offer anything else, because he understood now that some exchanges are not meant to be expanded, they are meant to be recognized and left as they are. and as he walked toward the exit, he passed the table where it had all begun. The contract now closed, the coffee replaced, the alignment gone, but the memory intact, and he picked up the cup again, this time without hesitation, and took a sip while it was still warm. And it was a small action, insignificant to anyone watching, but to him it marked something far more important than the deal he had just saved. It marked the moment he chose to notice what he had once ignored. And as he stepped out into the city, the noise returning, the world moving at its usual relentless pace, he carried that awareness with him, not as a lesson forced into words, but as a shift in how he would see from that point forward. Because the quiet ones are never truly ordinary, and the cost of ignoring them is never as small as it first appears. The city outside moved the same way it always had, fast, loud, indifferent to moments that changed everything for the people inside them. And as Ethan Caldwell stepped onto the sidewalk, the weight of what had just happened did not leave him. It followed him, not as pressure, but as clarity, a quiet awareness that settled deeper than any victory he had ever claimed, because this time nothing had been won, only understood, and the difference mattered more than he expected. And he paused just before the car door opened for him, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition that the version of himself who would have entered immediately, who would have turned the outcome into another story of control and dominance, no longer fit the moment he was in now. And when he finally sat inside the car, he did not reach for his phone. He did not call his team. He did not begin rewriting the narrative of the deal. He simply sat looking out through the glass as the city blurred into motion, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed silence to remain without filling it with action. And across town, inside the restaurant, Clara Whitmore continued her shift exactly as before, because for her nothing extraordinary had occurred. No applause, no acknowledgement, no shift in status, only a moment where she had seen something spoken once and then returned to her work when it was not received. And as she moved between tables, she did not replay the conversation, did not consider what might come from it, because she understood something. Ethan was only beginning to learn that value does not come from being recognized, it comes from being consistent, and the consistency had been there long before today, long before this moment, long before he ever noticed her. And the hours passed, as they always do, steady, unremarkable, until they were not. And when Ethan returned later that evening, it was not planned, not scheduled, not necessary, but it happened because something unfinished remained, not in the deal, not in the outcome, but in the understanding he had only just begun to form. And when he stepped back into the restaurant, the space felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had, in the details he had ignored before, now stood out clearly. The rhythm, the precision, the quiet coordination that held everything together without drawing attention to itself. And his eyes found Clara again, not immediately, not urgently, but inevitably, because once you see something clearly, it does not disappear again. And she noticed him this time, not with surprise, but with awareness, the same awareness she had carried all along. And he approached without the distance of hierarchy, without the assumption of importance, just a man returning to a place where he had learned something he could not afford to forget. And when he stopped in front of her, there was no performance, no introduction, only a simple question. "Can I sit?" he asked, and Clara gestured toward the table, without ceremony, of course. And he sat, not as a so, not as a client, but as someone willing to be present without control. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because not every silence needs to be broken. And when he finally did, his voice carried none of the urgency from before, only curiosity, the kind that does not demand answers, but invites them. "How did you see it?" he asked, and Clara considered the question, not because it was difficult, but because it required translation, not of language, but of perspective. "Most people look for what they expect," she said simply. "I look for what does not fit." And the answer settled between them, not as a revelation, but as a mirror. And Ethan nodded slowly, understanding that the difference between their perspectives had not been intelligence, but attention, not capability, but choice. And he leaned back slightly, letting the thought expand rather than closing it with another question. And Clara continued, "Because sometimes understanding needs a second layer, not more words, just clearer ones. People move fast," she said. "They trust patterns. Speed makes them feel in control, but speed hides details, and details are where truth usually sits." And Ethan let out a quiet breath, not of frustration, but of recognition, because every word aligned with something he had experienced, but never articulated. And he looked at her differently now, not searching for credentials, not measuring experience, but acknowledging clarity in its simplest form. And for the first time, the imbalance between them did not exist. because it had never been about position, it had always been about perception, and after a moment he reached into his jacket not to offer, not to compensate, but to remove the last habit that no longer belonged in this conversation, a business card. He placed it on the table between them and left it there, not pushing it forward, not attaching meaning to it, just present. And Clara glanced at it briefly, then back at him, her expression unchanged, because she understood what it represented and what it did not. And he spoke again, not with expectation, but with honesty. If you ever decide to leave this place, he said, there is a position where seeing what does not fit would matter. And Clara looked at him for a second longer this time, not weighing the offer, but understanding the intention behind it. And she shook her head, gently, not in rejection, but in clarity. I am not here by accident, she said. And the simplicity of that answer carried more certainty than any acceptance could have. And Ethan nodded again, not disappointed, not surprised, because for the first time, he was not trying to change the outcome, he was only acknowledging it. And he stood after a moment, placing enough on the table to cover the meal, and more, but not excessively, not as a transaction, but as appreciation, measured and quiet. And before he turned to leave, he paused just long enough to say something that mattered more than any offer. Thank you for saying it, even when I did not listen. And Clara met his gaze once more, her voice calm. As always, some people only hear things the second time, she said, and Ethan allowed himself a small smile, not because it was humorous, but because it was true. And as he stepped out into the night again, the city unchanged, the noise constant, he carried something with him that no deal, no contract, no victory had ever given him before, a shift, not in power, not in success, but in awareness. And from that point forward, the difference would not be visible to most, it would not appear in headlines or reports or numbers, but it would exist in every decision, every pause, every moment where he chose to look again instead of assuming he had already seen enough. And back inside, Clara continued her work as she always had, steady, precise, unnoticed by many, but no longer unseen by the one person who had finally understood that the quiet ones do not need to speak twice to be right, they only need to be heard once, and the rest depends on who is willing to listen.